This is Equip and Engage, a podcast by Subsplash, exploring how ministry, technology, and innovation come together to equip churches around the world to engage their communities.
Hey everyone, we're back with part 2 of our conversation with Russell Moore. Last time, we started to build an understanding of how pastors could prepare themselves and their churches to navigate today's highly politicized, controversial, hot-button topics. And today, we're going to get really practical before we ask Dr. Moore what other challenges he sees looming in the future for churches and church leaders. So let's dive in.
Just for sake of example, Nick and I were having conversations just around pastors we were talking to, and really around the issue of the vaccine mandate. So, for example, a pastor listening, dealing with the vaccine mandates, his elders are in a state that they're very hotly divided on the issue. And even, amongst the church elders, differing opinions. And in that, if you were to take some of those steps that you were talking about, so some that I wrote down there, considering the urgency of the issue, avoiding the hamster wheel. Can you walk us through how this pastor could thoughtfully engage with that issue of even just, fill in the blank, for this example, the vaccine mandates?
Yeah, well, if you're talking about the OSHA vaccine mandates or the private company vaccine mandates, I can't imagine a situation where I would address it at all. There are going to be a lot of other things that line up around that. So I would address it. You would have to address sort of what are our policies going to be at the church when it comes to nursery workers and, so forth. Well, then you have to address that. But you're not addressing sort of the political issue of the vaccine mandates. And if you have people in your congregation who are spreading misinformation and disinformation, or as I've seen in some congregations, trying to keep people from being vaccinated, I would address that as well, because that's coming up in that moment within the congregation, and people's lives are at risk on that. If, though, what you have is just people who are freaking out about vaccine mandates, and this is not consistent. They've not been freaking out about rubella and measles vaccination requirements in their school. This isn't consistent at all. Okay, I would not go in and do that on a Sunday morning. What I would do is to say, why are my people so freaked out? And, one of the reasons is they have a heightened paranoia. Why do they have a heightened paranoia? They're listening to some voices these voices have an interest in people being paranoid. Okay, I can't fix that right now. And I can't fix that on this issue. It's gone too far right now. I'm just seeing the results of it. But what I'm going to do is to start discipling. One of the areas of my discipling, whether through preaching or through other means, is going to be dealing with that sense of fear and that sense of narcissism that tends to come in with this sort of conspiracy theorizing. And that's what it is. People have a desire to, as C.S. Lewis put it, be in the inner ring and to say, I'm the one in the know. I know what Bill Gates is really doing, and whatever. So you can see that happening. You can say, okay, I've got to address that, but I can't do it right now with this. But I can try to work on it. I can try to work on it so that when the next thing comes around, at least people have a framework. And I can say to them at the beginning stages of this, hey, remember what we were talking about together earlier. I mean, I think that's just a better way to do it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And it feels like the repeated theme being, you're really driving at, what's the root that's going on, because the bigger responsibility for the church leader is that discipleship journey that they're going on. And so like you had mentioned before in the examples with how in Jesus's ministry, even how we see through the Gospels that he's just so masterful at knowing and addressing what the root cause or what the root of the problem is there.
Yeah, and also just what your particular calling is at the moment. Richard Mouw uses this great analogies explaining sphere sovereignty idea in Abraham Kuyper's tradition. And he says, look, what if you've got a guy who is a principal at a school and he finds out that his son, who is working for the school, has been embezzling money. The dad is also an elder at the church that they all belong to. Okay, he's got to respond to that as the principal, as an elder, and as a dad. Which means if he responds as a principal the way that he would as a dad, I love you unconditionally, or as an elder, repent and confess and we'll move forward, he's failing as a principal. And if he responds as the principal when he's in the role of the dad, he's failing as a dad. And so I think that when it comes to, for instance, vaccine mandates, I would have a different counsel if I'm talking about a Christian who's a public health official than I would someone who's a pastor. If you're a public health official, you don't have the option but to spend a lot of time educating people on the necessity of vaccine mandates. You can't say, well, this is a root problem, we're going to have to get to it later. But you, as a pastor, often, though, have to say, if I'm going to get deeper in here, I'm going to have to come at it sideways.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. And this is so helpful. And the other thing, I mean, even just looking practically today at these relevant topics, but also looking to the future, what other issues do you see coming into focus for the church? So what are some of the top problems that you are seeing, hey, the church is going to probably have to face this in the next 5 years? So to be able to even prep, like you said, for those candlelight dinners of setting the table there.
Political violence is one of them. I mean, if you look at some of the things that are happening in the United States and some of the conversations that I have with people at the top levels of various aspects of government or of social thought or what have you, are terrifying to me and would be very scary if they were to be said out loud. Because if you look at some of the things that have happened, they're things that would have sounded, if I had described Charlottesville in 2015, it would have sounded like a wacky conspiracy. This is not going to get that bad. And if I had described January 6th or some of the things that are going on in school boards in October of last year, it would have seemed, okay, you're being Chicken Little. You're catastrophizing something that's not going to happen. But what has happened? January 6th, in the immediate aftermath, everyone was sort of shaken, and I can't believe that this has happened. And then what happened after that? People started to find a way to say, well, maybe that's not the way to do it. But, when you're up against a wall, you do what you have to. I mean, that's very terrifying. And then the other thing is to realize that we have prepared for secularization in exactly the wrong way. And that is by secularizing Christianity. And we have actually fueled secularization because you assume, well, this problem is a cognitive problem or it's a moral problem. And so you give people the talking points to be able to have a Christian worldview, and you enable people to see how to withstand the moral revolution or what have you going on. And what you end up doing is creating often a kind of means to an end Christianity where the focus is on the outside rather than on the inside. So taking 1 Corinthians 5 and flipping it from the way it's supposed to be. And then you end up with, I'm dealing with very secular kids all the time and people out of Christian backgrounds who have walked away from the church. Almost none of them are because intellectually they're unable to believe that a virgin got pregnant. Almost never is it a case which would have been true, say 15 years ago when I was dean at a seminary and a student came in and said, I've lost my faith, I'm an atheist. That happened a few times. And I knew in every case something morally has gone wrong and this person is trying to justify it. And I was almost always right in that. That's not true now. Most of the people who are walking away from the faith are not doing so because they think that the moral constraints of the church are too tight. They're walking away from the church because they don't believe that the church itself believes what it's saying when it comes to the transcendent realities and what it means to morally live out the Christian life. Because they see those things shifting and changing depending upon what's useful at the moment. And anybody can sort of, given enough time, figure out, okay, this is useful. So what are they really trying to get at? And if what they're really trying to get at is some sort of political identity or some sort of tribal identity or some sort of cultural identity, then they're able to say, let's just cut out the middleman. I can have that. And that's why you have, just as happened on the left, where people were saying, okay, well, if what Christianity is really about is getting in and doing social reform and everything else is just a metaphor for that, well, I can do that. And I don't need the church. I don't have to give up a Sunday morning. It's happening now on the right, where you have people say, oh, okay, well, so if what this really ultimately is about is white identity politics, I can get that somewhere else. If this is really about sort of maintaining masculinity, I can get that somewhere else. And so you will look and see an entire generation of people and say, on the right, who are they listening to? On the left, who are they listening to? They're typically not listening to the same sorts of messages on the left that were coming through the civil rights movement and Fannie Lou Hamer and Cornel West and people like that. It's coming instead often from a very secularized form of what's happening. And on the right, they're listening to Jordan Peterson, Jungian, or they're listening to people like that. Our response is not to say, isn't that terrible? Our response ought to be to say, why? And what can we do in terms of the way that we are supposed to be following Christ in order to answer that?
Yeah, that's great, Dr. Moore. I'm curious if you've seen maybe a parallel to what you described in the secularizing Christianity in terms of them not, people outside the church or people who've walked away from the faith, not believing that Christians believe what we say we do because of our lives don't reflect it, whether, placing a higher identity in political identities or whatever else, or career or whatever else. I wonder if like the connector between these two responses is like a commoditization of Christianity, right? Because on the other side, I've seen maybe we've sold Christianity as this will get you the life that you want. And a lot of times, like kind of just anecdotally, what I've observed is people get to midlife and they go, this is what I was promised by the church. If I just follow Jesus, my marriage will be perfect. The kids will, be awesome and everything will turn out okay. And life is much harder, much darker, much more challenging.
Or it actually worked.
Yeah.
And what good is it? I don't want the same sort of life that I wanted when I was listening to the church. I mean, that happens too.
So is the commoditization of the faith? Like, is that the thing that would lead towards people not believing that we believe what we say we do, and people going, I was sold something that didn't turn out or did? Is that what it is? Okay.
Yes, I think it's the idea of Christianity as something that's useful in some way or the other. And so if you just look at your example, of marriage and parenting, and that's right. A lot of churches in the 70s and 80s knew, well, the people in my community, they don't care about justification, but they do care about how to have a marriage where we're not fighting with each other and how to be a good mom or dad. So we'll come in that way and talk to them. Now, does the scripture have a lot to say about marriage and parenting? Yes, as a second step, and in the context of a fallen universe where you're saying this is not a prosperity gospel for your family. You're going to carry a cross, and that cross is going to show up in your marriage, in your parenting, in your singleness, and whatever your situation is. That's not the option, is carry a cross or not. And so that's the same thing kind of is true, or not kind of, it's directly true when it comes to this. When people can say, you'll have the same people who will be preaching about politics all the time if they're dealing with abortion and marriage and those sorts of issues, rightly so. And then when the issue of race comes up, they say, well, that's political. You're distracting from the gospel if you talk about that, or vice versa. I mean, people can figure that out. And they can say, in the same way, I had someone who is an LGBT activist who was talking to me one time, and he said, you know who just really makes me angry are these welcoming and affirming Christian churches. And I said, why? He said, because they're not taking me seriously. I know how to read. I know what 2,000 years of Christian history is. And so when they get up and pretend all that's not there, he said, I can tell they're afraid of me. And that means they're going to tell me something that I want to hear. I don't need that. If that's true, if my very presence can dictate what it is that you're going to say or not say, then how can I trust you about being raised from the dead? He said, I don't agree with you on marriage and these sorts of issues. But if I'm going to start asking those questions, it's not going to be with people that I can tell are pandering to me. Now, all I would add to that is the same thing is true if what people are doing is not speaking to him because they're pandering to a group of people who think that somehow the gospel doesn't apply to their LGBT neighbors and that they ought to respond to them with loathing and fear rather than the way that we respond to any other person who is grappling with what does it mean to leave sin and follow Christ and so forth. So that's where I think the temptation is just to start, and I think it often happens, it almost always happens subtly. It never happens with someone saying, you know what, I don't want to get fired from my job, so I'm not going to talk about the racial injustices in our community. It doesn't happen that way. It usually happens with people who, almost like social media, where you get a dopamine hit when someone responds to a post. You get a sort of dopamine hit when what you're getting is amen, whether in your congregation that's verbal or it's just the way that people talk to you about something. That sort of changes the algorithm of the way that you see things. And at the same time, you're saying to yourself, here are some issues. I'll conserve my influence because I can't speak to those things right now because then I'll be gone. So I'm going to conserve it and I'm going to sort of work from the inside. And that time never comes. I mean, there's never a time when you say, you know what, our church can afford to split right now or for our wealthy donors to stop giving to our building program. Yeah. That day is never going to come. Yeah. And so that's usually, I think, how it happens.
Cool. Well, Dr. Moore, I have two final questions that kind of piggyback off of Carolyn's question about the future. You mentioned political violence. You mentioned secularizing Christianity. And the first question, I hope it's okay if I ask you just something personal. You've endured what many other pastors have endured in this last year, and you've gotten pretty beat up for stances that you've had to take publicly. I'm curious, what's that been like for you, and what are you doing as you look forward to the future and those issues to kind of prepare yourself, like you mentioned?
I don't think I've been beat up because I think I would consider myself to be beaten up if I had decided to change what it means for me to follow Christ in order to be somebody I don't want to be. And I don't think Jesus wants me to be. So I don't think that's the case. I do think, though, but your point is correct. It has been, in many ways, 5 years of not what people see on the outside. I mean, everybody's, no matter what you do, you're going to have people saying and disagree with it. But some of the psychological warfare kinds of spiritually abusive stuff that has happened on behind closed doors. And what that has enabled me to do, I think, is to sort of look back and see some things. It's almost like watching the Sixth Sense movie a second time, where you kind of know at the end he's dead the whole time. So you're paying attention to that. I can look back and sort of say, here were these warning signs going on around me that I would just say, well, that's an anomaly. That's not really what it's like. But then also to anybody who goes through sort of, and everybody will, something like that eventually, you start to then say what really matters to me and what doesn't matter to me. And then you start asking who matters to me. And not who matters to me in terms of who I love, but who matters to me in terms of who I respect enough to go to say, what do you think? I think those moments teach us all that eventually.
Cool. Thank you, Dr. Moore. Well, then, as we are talking to church leaders and pastors, and you've laid out what you see coming in the future, how do you think that they might need to reimagine their approach to discipleship in light of what you see coming?
Well, I think there are a number of ways, but I think one of the key ways is the importance of liturgy. And by that, I don't just mean what some would call high church liturgy, although that's certainly included, but the sense of rhythm and sameness in the Christian life as opposed to just novelty. So I grew up in a really what people would call low church. I don't think there was, if anything was lower church than we were, they were in the sub-basement. So we were very low church, but it was a very liturgical church. And what I mean by that is every single Sunday, there are going to be hymns that are kind of our, some people have a canon within a canon. We had a hymnal within a hymnal, the hymns that we were going to sing regularly. There was going to be an altar call invitation at the end, which wasn't just about lost people. It was, we knew that was going to happen. And when Just As I Am is playing, we're able to then think through, am I the same person who walked down that aisle? And if not, why not? What in my life, what in a time when I was driven toward going down there and not caring what anybody thought and just kneeling on those steps and praying, what's there now? That was every week. And then if you look at the commonalities of those wedding services from the Book of Common Prayer and funeral services from the Book of Common Prayer, that everybody, you knew when you're at a funeral and you hear words being said, those are the words that were said now when my brother has died here, that were used with when my father died. And those are the words they're going to be saying when I die. That in a world where people are just they think they're craving novelty, that need for stability and sameness is going to become all the more crucial for the church.
I love that. So Thank you, Dr. Moore, for your time today. We really appreciate you being with us.
It's great.
Well, thanks for having me. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, you too.
Dr. Moore, bringing that courage and conviction. Awesome. He is such a deep thinker. Nick, what was your number one takeaway from that conversation? I know I wrote down several, but what was your number one takeaway?
I mean, it's so hard to narrow it down to one. I think it was helpful for church leaders who are listening to just be reminded that they're not alone in what they're facing, the challenges of our day and age. I think his take on the future and the future issues that church leaders will need to consider how to navigate well is vital for those of you who listen to the podcast to really consider and ideally work together to address. And then I just like personally, his courage and his conviction and even his response to my question about being beaten up. And he's like, I'm not beaten up. Like I just love that. I think that is helpful for those who are listening, who are in a similar place, who might feel worn down, but not defeated, to give them some language for that as well.
Yeah. And I mean, what a beautiful way that he ended it too, just with the beauty of liturgy that can be. I mean, as he was talking about it, it just felt like in a world where there's so much media, so much information coming at us, that it just felt like fresh water. I loved how he ended there. But well, thanks again to Dr. Moore, and thanks to everyone listening today. We have more conversations planned just like this one, conversations to help pastors navigate through their unique challenges of doing ministry in a complex digital age. And let's be real, there are many other challenges too, which is why we built the Subsplash platform, to make it simple to stay connected with your church. Once again, to connect with our team, just visit subsplash.com/go. And make sure you don't miss out on future episodes. Subscribe to Equip and Engage wherever you listen to your podcasts. And until next time, we'll see you then.